Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a scene that I sort of accidentally came by when I was walking through Venice. And let's start by masking the sides of the paper. I was just walking through Venice on a slightly rainy day, and while I was chatting with my friend, I turned my head and looked at a really quick scene of an alleyway. I thought it had interesting textures and flat colors that made the composition look sort of graphic, so I just mindlessly took one of those really quick snaps and just paused the alleyway. But it's just really cool that this quick accidental picture could be an inspiration for today's painting. I love the lines and the composition this picture has, however, because I didn't spend too much time thinking about it when I was snapping the picture, I didn't even fix the aspect ratio, so it was really long. And I tried to fit everything in, even though my paper is wider than the ratio of the original picture. So in order to fit all the elements in, I had to sort of sacrifice and reduce the length of certain buildings. For me, I definitely sacrificed the length of the yellow part of the building, and I just tried to make it work. I wanted to include the floor also because I love the reflective wet texture, but at the same time, I don't want to sacrifice the area of the sky because I just find that the blue works so well with the other colors, and it also adds to the flat graphic feel of the composition, which then again added to the shorter length of the buildings. So here I just sketched out the basic lines using my ruler because this time I do want the lines to be as clean as possible, and I made sure to get all of the buildings in before adding the smaller features like the doors, stairs, and so on without sketching too much of the details. Because I had to make my own ratio for the buildings, the other features will be affected by it. So things like the door, windows, the gate to the canal will be wider, and I just customized it according to the framing of my sketchbook. Like for the yellow area, I also added 3 windows instead of 2 to fill in the space. I do prefer the longer composition, and if you guys also prefer the same, you can actually tape down more of the sides of your sketchbook to create a closer ratio to the original picture, but sadly I didn't think of it when I was in the middle of sketching mine. Lastly, for the sketch, I decided to just add lines for parts of the bricks and also the floor. Personally, it's just for me to take a mental note of where the perspective lines are, but it's completely optional because later I'm actually just going to paint over it. I first tried painting this using watercolors, but once it dried off, I didn't like how the lighter colors look. It was lacking a lot in vibrancy from the pastel colors, so I decided to paint over it using my HIMI gouache. Here are the colors. This is burnt umber, earth yellow, lemon yellow, medium yellow, Ponceau, white, black, Prussian blue, sky blue, and grass green. I'm going to begin by painting the sky using a mix of white and sky blue, and the color that I'm trying to create is actually very close to the watercolor. I just want to have a higher coverage and also for it to have a bit more vibrancy. For the whole painting, I'm not going for a cartoony effect, so I actually don't mind if there are variations to the color. Like for the sky, it's okay if parts of it has more white in the ratio and is slightly lighter, as long as the colors are nicely blended. After I'm done with the base blue of the sky, I used a lighter blue with more white in the ratio to add some really subtle cloud texture. For the green windows, I used a mix of grass green and Prussian blue. It's going to create this really dark blue-green color, which I'm going to paint as the base color. Then I'm going to use the same mix with added white, and I'm going to paint this lighter color underneath while leaving parts of the base color at the top to act as shadows. I'm also going to do the same thing for the other window. You can also approach this the other way around. So for the door here, I'm starting with the light green. Then once I'm done covering the whole area, I'm going to add the darker green at the top and then softening the blend using a clean damp brush. I'm going to do a similar gradient to the door and the window at the bottom, but this time I added a bit of medium yellow to make the color a bit more grayish. Next, I'm going to paint the base color of the red house. For the red, I used Ponceau mixed with burnt umber and a tiny bit of Prussian blue. Then I'm going to add a little bit of white to turn it into a pastel color. Near the top underneath the roof, I would use a mix with less white and a bit more burnt umber and Prussian blue to create a darker red. Then I'm going to soften the blend by using more of the lighter red while the surface of the dark red is still wet. For the second floor, I'm going to use a mix of medium yellow, lemon yellow, and a tiny bit of white to create a pastel yellow. I'm going to start by painting on the base color, trying to cover as much area as possible. And while the surface is still wet, I added a bit of that dark red mixture from before, mixed with a bit of yellow that I already had on my brush, and this will create sort of like a muddy brown. I'm just going to add this near the bottom of the window to show that the building is a bit old and worn out. And I tried to blur it out by adding more of the yellow and just trying to rub it together and try to mix the colors so the brown is a bit more subtle. Next, I'm going to paint the building on the left. For this, I used the same red as before, but I added the pastel yellow, and this will create a slightly muted pink color. I like to also vary the tone by playing around with the ratio. After that, I'm going to leave it to dry and move on to the beige building. For this, I'm going to use a lot of white with some earth yellow and a little bit of the red mix. If your color looks a bit too yellow or warm, you can add a little bit of Prussian blue to mute the color further. On the left side of the building, I tried to make it lighter, and on the front-facing one, I used the exact same mixture but with less white, and to darken certain areas, like for shadows or for a bit of texture to the exterior, I would add a bit more Prussian blue as well as burnt umber. For the shadow directly under this window, I'm going to darken it further so it creates a really harsh edge. And for the color, I just used a mix of Prussian blue and burnt umber with a tiny bit of white. Then I tried to soften it using the base color in a light consistency while the dark brown is still quite wet, which will create a softer transition. I forgot to paint the window at the top. For this, I just used the same green mix as the windows before, but I used a lot of white in the mixture. Using a really light consistency of Prussian blue and burnt umber, I'm going to add some of the markings like before to make the building look a little bit more old and worn out. Then of course I'm going to just soften the blend while the surface is still a little bit damp, and in the process still adding a little bit of white here and there for a bit more added texture. After painting all the buildings, I felt like the yellow is looking a bit flat, so I decided to add a bit more saturation in the yellow. And I also wanted to add more texture, so I added a bit more color variation. At the bottom of the beige building, there was a little bit of stain from the water on the exterior. So for this, I used the same mix as before, but I added a bit more earth yellow and red to make the stain warmer. And I'm just going to treat this as the other textures before. I'm going to make more of the beige mixture, and I'm going to paint a light beige color for the base of the top of this building. And I just want to add a darker version of this color, or you can also use a mix of burnt umber and Prussian blue to line the bottom. I'm also going to add the darker color at the top, but I'm going to soften the blend, going back in with the same base color while the surface is still wet. Once I'm done, I'm going to use the light version of this color, which means it has more white in the mix. I made a couple of thick vertical lines. I'm also going to line the top and bottom thinly. After doing this, I felt like it needs more contrast of the shadows. So here I'm just going to line those features separately and also use a thin consistency of the shadow color. Once the surface is nice and dark, I want to wait for it to completely dry. Then I'm going to go back in with white. I'm going to paint two vertical ovals close to each other until I fill in the whole space. Then add two tiny dots at the top and the bottom of those ovals. Once I'm done, I felt like the shadows weren't strong enough, so here I'm just going to go over the shadow areas again to darken it. This is just to enhance the shapes that we painted earlier. Next, I'm going to paint the base color of the roof. For this, I'm going to create an orange from the yellow mix from earlier with Ponceau. As for the color variation, I'm going to add a bit of gray. So for the gray, I just used a mix of black with white, and I also added a little bit of the orange, so the tonality is very similar. Once I get a good coverage, I'm going to leave it to dry and move on to the brick on the right hand side. For this, I just use the beige as base first, and I also want to vary the color using more of the burnt umber as well as the orange that I already have on my palette. So I'm just going to keep reusing the mixes that I already have and adjust the ratio slightly to create different variations. Here I felt like the base was a bit too light, so I went over certain areas with the orange mix as well as the burnt umber. There's a bit of railing at the top and the bottom of the brick, so I'm just going to separate those two areas by making sure that the base color is a bit lighter and also adding a bit of burnt umber as shadows. There's more brick wall on the left, so here I'm just applying the same base color. Same goes for the area here, so I'm applying the same base color with the same variation. Before adding on the brick textures, I just want to make sure everything's completely dry, so I'm going to move on to paint the base color of the floor. For the base color of the floor, I'm going to use the beige color mix from before, which is basically a mix of all the colors that I've used so far with a lot of white. And depending on the tone that you want, if you want it to be a bit more mute or warmer, you can change up the ratio. So here you can see certain areas have a bit more orange, certain areas have a bit more Prussian blue to make it more of a muted brown color. I basically tried to make the color of the floor reflect whatever is surrounding it. So I added a bit more of a warmer tone close to the brick walls, and where the concrete railings are next to the stairs, I made the floor a bit lighter than the rest. Here I start to paint the stairs by using the beige mix with added earth yellow. As for the concrete railings, I used the same beige mix as before, but I added more of the darker tones with burnt umber, black, and a bit of that orange. I'm treating it the same way as how I painted the long stains on the beige building, but I made this part darker since I feel this area has been exposed to more moisture. I'm also going to use the same color as the exterior of this building to paint the base color of the stairs. Here I felt like the value of the railing is too close to the orange of the wall, so I decided to darken it and create a clear separation between the two elements. I'm also going to do the same for the floor. This time though I added a bit of blue so the temperature is different to separate those elements further. While I still have the light beige color on my palette, I'm just going to use it to line the door frame as well as the window frames. This part I kind of just made up, so I'm just going to color the windows using the same green color for the shutters. Inside the door on the left, I'm just going to color it gray, and this will just add a bit more depth. At the top, I'm going to darken it using a bit of black, and then I soften the blend. I'm going to do the same thing for the top part. I just made this one a little bit darker. I used black and a little bit of Ponceau to create a dark maroon color. I felt the value is a little bit too dark though, so I decided to lighten it by glazing over a light pink mix from the exterior of the building. Here I wanted to make sure the decorative element of the building is clear, so I just paint over it using the lighter value. Next, for the wooden stairs, I used a little bit of black with Ponceau and yellow with a bit of white to create this orangey brown color. I also felt like the stairs were a bit too far apart, so I ended up painting more lines in between the ones that I've already painted. Then I relined the top part of the line using a lighter version of the same color, which is the same mix with added white. To give the stairs some thickness and form, I use a mix of Ponceau with black, and I'm just going to line it very thinly at the bottom of each of the stairs. Now onto the stairs on the right hand side, I'm going to use a bit of orange, earth yellow, and black, and I'm just going to add some lines on top of the base color that I've already painted. After that, I'm going to use a light version of the same mix, so I just added white to it, and I'm just going to use this color to paint in between the darker lines. As for the pots on top, I used the blue-green mix from the window, and I'm going to add some white and also a little bit of black to mute the color, so it turns out to be this cool gray mixture. Using whatever's left on my brush, I just write some squiggles for the signage here. Then I use a bit of black, Ponceau, and burnt umber to add some shadows underneath the balcony. Now onto the texture, I'm going to start with the rooftop. Here I use a mix of Ponceau, black, and yellow ochre with a bit of white, and this will create an orangey brown color. I'm just going to line each of the downward curve, following the perspective lines. At the top, I'm just going to connect all of those lines and also paint on the curves. Then I'm going to finish this up by painting on one horizontal line for the top part of the roof. I'm going to add more black into the previous mixture to make the downward curves look a bit deeper. Then I'm going to use the same mix to paint individual curves for the outline of the roof tiles. At the top, I'm just going to add some short diagonal lines to represent each of the tiles piled on top of each other. For the colors of the tiles, I want to add some grays. So for this, I use the same color mixture but with added black and white to basically mute and take down the saturation. But with this said, I also played around with the ratio for some of the tiles, and I'm only painting some of them. Using the dark brick color, I'm going to line the separation between the brick wall and the pink wall. Then I'm going to add thin lines using that color to separate the brick texture. While adding on the texture or the lines, I want to follow the direction of the perspective. So from the bottom, the lines are a bit more diagonal, and as I get towards the top, the lines become a bit more horizontal. Next, I'm going to paint the actual texture of the bricks using the same mixture as before, but with a bit more gray in the mixture. And here I just flatten my brush and I try to create a single brick and a double brick. Since the space is quite small for the single brick, I just painted the whole area. As for the double brick, I just left a little bit of negative space in between with the base color. To further add to the texture, of course, I'm going to add some varied colors. by playing around with the ratio. This is for the brick itself and also the lines in between the bricks. Now moving on to the red building, I'm going to just add a bit of shadow around the frame of the window and the frame of the door. So this is from a mix of Ponceau and black. I just want the shadows to be very subtle here. After that, I'm going to move on to paint the bricks underneath. So I'm going to line the bricks using the beige mix, or it can actually be any light color that you have on your palette. And here I want the top to be slightly protruding outward, so I painted a little bit of shadow underneath. Then I'm going to continue on to paint the lines of the brick. Next, I'm going to fill in the brick color. So again, I'm going to take that mixture from Ponceau with a bit of black, yellow, earth yellow, a bit of white, and so on, and play around with the ratio. And I'm going to basically just fill in the color of the bricks. One brick doesn't have to only have one color, it can have multiple different tones. At the bottom though, I do want the bricks to be a little bit darker as it's in more contact with the water from the canal. Here I felt like adding more of the stain, so I'm just using the dark color from the brick actually, and just separating those two areas and painting on some lines. From time to time, I will go back to certain areas again after painting details in other areas just to balance out the contrast in value and the amount of detail within the painting. Here I'm going back to the door. I'm using the mix of Prussian Blue and grass green, and then I just try to soften the blend using a clean damp brush. Then I'm going to go back again using the same mix to line the details of the door. I'm going to move on to paint the brick wall on the right hand side, and this is a really large one, and this one passes the horizon point. So the lines for the brick at the top will be facing downwards diagonally, and towards the middle the line will be a bit more horizontal, and at the bottom the diagonal line will go upwards. I'm going to paint per section, so starting with this protruding part of the brick, this part will be the darkest since it's going to be under a tree. So I started out by using burnt umber to line the top part of the brick wall. Then to paint it on, I just used a dark orangey brown mix. I'm not going to add too much detail for now, but focus on the direction of the lines, making sure that the perspective is correct. And I'm going to work per section. Here I kind of realized as I'm painting the lines downwards that the lines were getting thicker and thicker, so I'm going to stop here and fill in the color of the bricks first, starting with a really dark value at the top, and of course playing around with the different ratios of the color so I can create different variations. As I fill in the color of the bricks downwards, I try to make the tone a little bit lighter, but at the same time, I still try to vary some of the colors. As I get towards the bottom of the section, here I'm just going to paint over using the brick color to paint over the white line so I can basically work on this section again. And I'm also going to use this color to lightly tap my brush and glaze over the brick texture that I've already painted so the detail doesn't become too overwhelming for the rest of the painting. So from there, after erasing, I just use the same method to paint on the lines and then to fill in the rest of the space using different variation of the brick color. Next, I'm going to move on to the details of the floor. For this, I'm using a really dry brush load and a medium consistency of mix between black and burnt umber. And I just, again, want to get the perspective right vertically, then paint the rest of the horizontal lines. Now I'm going to paint the wet reflection on the street. And here I'm using a few different colors for the mix. I use earth yellow as the main color, added a bit of Prussian blue and black as well as a bit of orange. And here I'm just painting the middle of each of the tile, and I'm trying to follow a similar color to whatever is surrounding it as I did before for the base color. So for the area near the stairs, as you can see, I used a bit of this earth yellow. For the pillar of the railings, I used the beige color, and where the brick walls are, I used the orangey mix. I'm only going to color the center of the tiles, leaving whatever surrounding it as the base color, and I don't mind including a few different colors in one stone tile depending on whatever surface it reflects. When I'm doing this, I'm also looking at the reference image in case I'm not aware of the full surrounding that's not captured within the frame, because water reflection can get a little bit tricky. Like as an example, this part of the stone tile is next to the brick wall, but the color of the tiles that is on the reference image is actually quite dark. I'm not sure if this is maybe from the tree on top or behind the brick wall, but I tried to follow both my instincts as well as the reference image. For some of the stone tiles which has two colors, I'm just going to go back in to soften the blend between the two colors, and this will just make the transition between colors a bit more fluid. The next element that I'm going to paint is the tree on the right. I'm going to begin by painting the branches using the brown that I already have on my palette, the dark brown there. And I'm starting out with a few branches, then using a mix of Prussian blue with the grass green. I'm going to paint really dark leaves on the branches, and I'm going to paint a lot of leaves which are more densely packed near the brick wall. The closer I am to the brick wall, the more leaves I'm going to paint. It doesn't really matter if they're piled on top of each other because I want them to act as the base color of the leaves. As I'm piling on the leaves though, I do want to leave out the branches that I've already painted so they look like it's in front of the leaves. The next thing I'm going to paint are lighter leaves. I added white to the previous mixture and added more leaves near the dense part of the tree. And after that, I use an even lighter green with added medium yellow in the mixture. And I'm placing them around the branch as well as on top of the layers that I've already painted. I'm going to keep on doing this and add more white or lighter colors. So now you can see a slight difference in value from the darker leaves behind and the lighter leaves in front. Once I've established a good density, I'm going to add more fine branches surrounding it just to make sure I like the way it sits in the composition. Lastly, for the tree, I want some of the leaves to fall over the brick wall, and this will just add a bit more dimension and depth. I started with the dark green again, and then I piled on the lighter green on top so the darker green becomes more of a shadow. Then to separate the colors more, I added darker values to the texture of the brick wall. I'm basically done with all the main features. The next thing I'm going to paint are the decorative elements. So here I'm just lining the top part of the building using a mix of black and burnt umber, and then adding on more shadows to separate the window frames as well as the faces of the building. Here at the edge, I just use a really light consistency of black, and I'm just going to soften it. And there's actually a green pipe that goes through from the top of the building to the bottom, so I just used the same color as the windows and just painted a single line. For this part I'm painting, I'm not sure what it is, but I just used the beige color, and then I use a dark red mix to paint the shadows to separate it from the exterior wall. I'm also going to do the same by adding on shadows for the pink building here. I seem to have forgotten to paint the potted plants here, so for the base color of the leaves, I used the same light green mix as the tree, and I added a bit more earth yellow to make a different tone of green. I just painted dots on top of the pot and also dots running down so it looks like parts of the leaves are cascading. And for the darker leaves, I just used the dark green that I already have on my palette to paint it in between the greenery and the pot. Using the same color, I'm also going to just add a line in the middle of the blinders to separate them. Then I'm going to create a grayish color by using the sky blue with white and the dark red mix, which has a little bit of black and Ponceau. And I'm going to use this color to paint on the security bars in front of the door and the windows. I first just frame it within the area. Then I'm going to paint on thinner lines horizontally and vertically, creating this square or checker pattern. As for the window, I'm going to start by doing the same thing, which is to frame the bars first. After that, I'm going to add the horizontal lines and double vertical lines. I felt like the base color is too light, so there weren't enough contrast, so I'm going to just darken the top part. As for the window bars on this window, I'm just going to paint on diagonal lines going across each other. Then using the same gray mix, I'm also going to start painting the railings on the bridge. I first painted the design on using the gray mixture. Then I'm going to add more depth by adding shadows underneath as well as on the sides using Prussian Blue. Next, I'm going to paint the same design for the railings of the canal. And this time I'm just using black. I first started out by painting squares and then circles in the middle and lines going inwards diagonally and also vertically. On the right, I'm going to paint a door with the same design, but this time I'm going to skew the shapes. Lastly, as a final little detail, I'm going to add poles on top of the building, and also this probably a TV cable pole or something like that. Then I'm going to make final adjustments, adding more contrast or value to certain parts of the painting just to make sure everything is balanced. So once I'm done with the final adjustment, I'm going to unmask everything, and that's finally it. This painting took me so long to finish. I had around 5 hours of footage to edit where I actually missed certain parts when I was filming. So this whole painting probably took me around 6 hours total, but I really enjoyed the process and I feel through this painting I got used to using gouache as a medium a little bit more. And yeah, this is the final painting. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys like what you see here, please consider subscribing. Thanks so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!